the Russian forces have beaten up very badly.
Will the spring offensive start in this month?
Well, we're early in this month, and I think we can see, again, shaping operations. I think we can see setting of conditions. There are a couple of conditions that have been publicly acknowledged. President Zelensky noted that he had wanted some more armored systems, but it seems as if over the weekend he said that they have what they need. And then just having really firm ground so that tanks with tracks can go off-road, get off the roads, go cross-country without getting mired. That is not a trivial issue. If you run your 60-ton tank or 70 tons when the M1s arrive across country and they get mired in the mud and you have to do a recovery operation while being hammered by artillery, that is obviously not the ideal condition. I think that the offensive is going to be much more successful than many of the more pessimistic analysts have been offering. I think that the Ukrainians are very much ready for this. They'll be very distinctive because they will be employing Western tanks, Western infantry fighting vehicles, Western wheeled armored vehicles, and so forth, in large measure for the first time in this war, certainly in this number. I think the Russians will prove to be more brittle than the expectation is. Keep in mind, these units have been in combat for over a year, many of them. They have not been pulled offline to reconstitute by having forces replaced, equipment replaced and repaired, and then doing training before they go back. They just get individual replacements to fill the gap. They're not well trained, they're not well equipped, they're not well led. And I think that these Ukrainian forces, which are well trained, are well equipped, we are going to break through. And then you might see a real dynamism to the battlefield that could give real opportunities to the Ukrainians to exploit. So the losses they've sustained have been enormous. They're bringing old tanks out of mothballs, essentially, out of storage, refurbishing them, pushing them into the battlefield. There are reports there are actually T-55 tanks, which really are just a post-World War II tank. That does not bode well for the Russians, and they've depleted some stocks of ammunition. They're certainly still hammering away at Kyiv. Every night that I was there were multiple air raid alerts and sirens, but the Ukrainians have really perfected their air defenses. They're taking down every drone and every cruise missile. It doesn't mean there can't be damage if the debris hits someone, which it did tragically. One night alone, there were 3 individuals killed. But they're very impressively protecting their capital and a number of the other critical locations of Ukraine. I don't know that there's a huge impact on the looming offensive. There's obviously an enormous impact on the citizens of the 80 towns and villages that have been flooded by this, on the livestock, on the zoo animals who tragically perished, other than the ducks and the swans, on the reduction in electrical generation, and on the impact on the water supply, which includes, by the way, that which goes to Crimea. This presumably was done by the Russians. There are public accounts that U.S. intelligence has indications that it was Russians. President Zelensky, of course, very publicly denied any involvement, and I cannot imagine that he would do that if there was Ukrainian involvement. So the real question in my mind is, was this just one more example of Russian incompetence? Because there were reports last week of some issues with that dam. There's so much water behind it and so forth. There were cracks or what have you. Or did they literally blow the dam up, thinking that somehow this might delay the offensive or disrupt it in some way? But I don't think that that is going to be the case.
Well, the significance of this is that it's a major distraction for the Russians at a time when they were trying to celebrate the final victory in Bakhmut, the city that they've largely destroyed. There's still a tiny Ukrainian element that's defending a remnant of that. But of course, that was one of the major objectives of their winter offensive, the rest of which objectives were not achieved. So really the big picture here, and we shouldn't lose sight of it as we focus on this little skirmish by these militia elements, the Legion, which again are pro-Ukrainian Russian, all Russian forces that have certainly distracted the Russians. There are elements that are having to respond to this as we speak. But the big picture is that we're in a moment of transition. The Russian winter offensive has culminated. It did not achieve all of its gains, the final, quote, victory in Bakhmut notwithstanding. And oh, by the way, on the flanks of Bakhmut, the Ukrainians have been counterattacking and taking those back from Russia. And you have the head of the mercenary Wagner group, Prigozhin, who's saying that he's going to withdraw his forces from Bakhmut and give them 2 months of of retraining and relaxation and so forth. So a very tenuous situation there, even as they are claiming this great seeming victory. But what we should look ahead to, of course, is this looming and very important Ukrainian counteroffensive. What we've seen so far are counterattacks. The counteroffensive is hugely important. This will use the additional Ukrainian brigades that have been trained and equipped largely now with Western tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, and so forth. And there is an enormous amount riding on this. I personally think that this is going to be really quite successful. I think that the Russian forces have beaten up very badly. They're no longer cohesive. They're not coherent in terms of command and control. Russian commanders have been replaced every few months. You have individual replacements that aren't well trained, aren't well equipped. The units, again, are not very well disciplined, and they're going to have to withdraw under pressure of this Ukrainian offensive, the most difficult possible tactical maneuver, and I don't think they're going to do well at that. The Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, they have not been in combat for 15 straight months the way the Russians have. They've not sustained, these units have not sustained the losses that the Russians have. They've been in training in Germany, Eastern Poland, Ukraine, UK, and elsewhere, and very well equipped, disciplined, cohesive, and of course, they're fighting for Ukraine's war of independence. And so I think the implications of this are going to be very substantial. I do think that the Ukrainians are going to do better than a lot of analysts assess they will, and that's hugely important because of the overall importance of keeping Western support for Ukraine and ultimately convincing Putin that he's not going to be able to outsuffer the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans. I believe that we'll see for the first time in this war on either side the achievement of true combined arms effects. In other words, the results of tanks protected by infantry against anti-tank guided missiles, artillery and mortars keeping the enemy's heads down, engineers reducing the obstacles, breaching these fortifications that the Russians have established, air defense keeping the Russians off the Ukrainians, electronic warfare jamming the Russians' already inadequate command and control facilities, and all orchestrated by very, very good Ukrainian command and control, and also using drones out over the Russians to attack them in depth with the precision munitions that the US and UK and others have provided. And this, I think, is going to break the front lines. Where they do this attack, I won't speculate on that, although the Ukrainians have publicly stated that their objective, of course, is to sever that ground line of communications that enables the Russians to go along the southeast coast into Crimea. And I think this is going to be impressive. We achieved combined arms effects, say, during the fight to Baghdad when I was a two-star general, and it's terrifying for the enemy. And the difference this time over, say, what happened in Kharkiv last fall, where the Ukrainians did carry out a very successful attack, is that when the lead elements culminate after 72, 96 hours, it's as far as you can physically go. There are follow-on forces that will capitalize, that will exploit and maintain the momentum and continue this.